Russian drones hit into Poland yesterday, and there was a lot of concern that as NATO issued its first Article 4th demonstration in quite a long time, when Poland shot down a number of Russian drones that veered into Polish airspace, there was much concern in the aftermath of, was this the potential opening round of World War III for the expansion of the war? Since that time, it seems that things have kind of calmed down a lot as we found out that these were unarmed drones, that they were not the kind of they were not apparently the Garens that have been striking so much destruction inside Ukraine. So it's actually unclear what happened, but so far it hasn't ramped up anything yet. But it has illustrated some of the risks and the dangers of how the war could even accidentally be expanded. And to see where this is going to go and what may be next, we have with us one of the biggest fans of our show, or from our show, is John Mearsheimer, international relations theorist, professor of political science at the University of Chicago, and big-time friend of the show. Welcome back, as always.
As always, Danny, I'm glad to be back.
Well, listen, let me just, I wonder what your thoughts were when you first heard that Russian drones had penetrated Polish airspace and then been shot down by apparently a pretty coordinated effort, NATO effort, not just Polish effort, inside the country of Poland.
Well, I think there are three possibilities here. One is that the Russians actually targeted Poland. They were sending us a message, us meaning the West. That's one possibility. Another possibility is these drones just veered off course. And given the fact that the attack on the evening that the drones wandered into Poland, the attack inside of Ukraine was so huge, it is possible that a couple drones did wander into Polish airspace. And then the third possibility is that the Ukrainians jammed a number of those drones, sent them off course in a haywire kind of fashion, and they ended up going into Belarus and then into Poland, or going directly into Poland. It seems to me, Danny, that it's hard to believe that the Russians purposely attacked Poland with drones. It just doesn't make any sense at all. To me, the Russians have no interest in provoking NATO at this point in time. I think it's probably either those drones just naturally went off course on their own, or they were jammed and they went into Poland, or they went into Belarus and then into Poland. So I think it's either the second or third alternative. But as you pointed out, these were not armed drones. They didn't kill anybody. They didn't do significant damage by any means. But what's happening here, of course, is the West is blowing this up into a major event, all for the purpose of demonizing the Russians and mobilizing the West against Russia.
And we've certainly seen a lot of that. I'm going to have some examples to show, because like this idea in Washington politics is never let a crisis go to waste. Always use it to your advantage. I think that applies in this area as well. Whether it was intentional or not, there's no doubt that many in Europe and Ukraine have seized upon this opportunity to, shall we say, put forward their favorite views and to give them a little bit more life. More on that in a second. But before we get there, I want to talk about, you mentioned that this incursion came as part of a over 400 air attack into Ukraine from the Russian side, which does continue on a near nightly attack, anywhere from 300 to 400 up to 800, as happened just a few days ago. And Ukraine simply doesn't have the capacity to shoot down everything that's coming in. And so every night there's lots and lots of destruction across the board throughout the depth of Ukraine. Meanwhile, as it always seems to be the case, it's along the front lines of where the real issues are. And just a few days ago, Alexander Syrsky, the commanding general for the Ukraine side, admitted that Russia has a threefold advantage on the front line, and in some areas it can prevail by 4 to 6 times. Now, in terms of where this war is going, what does that tell you?
Well, I'll tell you, Danny, when you sort of look at the various indicators that determine who wins in those battles up on the front line, there are three things that I look at. Number one is the overall ratio of forces on the two sides. And when General Syrskyi, who is the Ukrainian commander, tells us that the Russians overall outnumber the Ukrainians 3-1, and at some critical points along the front line, the Ukrainians are outnumbered 6-1, you know they're really in deep trouble. Furthermore, there's all sorts of evidence coming from the Ukrainian side that they do not have enough forces to cover the front line. In other words, you have this huge front line that has to be covered by the Ukrainian army. And they have so few troops at this point in time that they're big gaps, they're open spaces in the front line. And when the Russians discover those front lines, they invariably make a penetration. So this is a huge problem. And then the third indicator that I look at has to do with what the percentage of available manpower is in the various brigades that are fighting on the Ukrainian side. And Putin has recently said, and I think there's no reason to doubt it, that the Ukrainian brigades are operating at about 50%, with about 50% of their available or their needed manpower, not their available manpower. They have about 50%. That's what's available of the needed manpower. These are brigades that are barely capable of functioning. When you've been attrited down to the point where your brigades only have 50% of the required manpower, you're in real trouble. So I would say that if you look at these three key indicators, the overall force ratio, the force to space ratios, and the available amount of manpower inside each brigade, the Ukrainians are in desperate straits.
Yeah, and if anybody doesn't say, oh, well, Vladimir Putin, of course, he's going to exaggerate everything and he's going to make it sound worse than it is. Well, don't take his word for it. Take the brigade commander of the 44th Brigade, who just, I believe this was released yesterday, on Ukrainian media. You see, he went public and talked about this. We don't have the people to cover every meter of the front. So that really validates exactly what you just said there. And you also got to imagine, it seems pretty amazing to me that he's taken the risk of publicly saying this, because heretofore that's like been a kind of a no-no. You just don't talk openly about some of your weaknesses. But what does that tell you that he's willing to go public with this?
I think he's probably trying to send a signal to the higher echelons that they need more manpower and that they're in desperate straits and that something has to be done. And I think that would be the purpose of advertising this fact. And I would assume that the Russians know what these numbers look like anyway, and the Russians understand this problem that the Ukrainians have. So it's not like he's signaling classified information to the Russians. I think he's trying to tell people up top that we need more troops up on the front line. But the problem, as we know very well, is that the Ukrainians are incapable, for a variety of reasons, in raising the manpower that's necessary to replace those men who have been lost in the various brigades on the front line, and to just beef up the frontline forces to the point where they can cover the entire front. And they have something that approximates a 1-to-1 ratio with the Russians.
And even that might not be enough to slow it down, but they certainly want to get closer. The problem is, also according to Ukrainian sources here in the last week or so, is that they report that the Russian side continues to mobilize about 35,000 people per month, and they don't lose a fraction of that. Maybe somewhere around, by some estimates, 3,000 or 4,000 total that are killed and wounded per month on the Russian side, much lower than what is commonly ascribed to. But that tells you that the Russian military is growing, and so they don't have a problem plugging the gaps of the places they want to have this 6-to-1 advantage at the key areas, et cetera. And one has to wonder, how much longer can those dynamics exist without there being some kind of a break in the Ukraine line?
Yeah, there's two things I think going on with the Russians. Number one is that they are actually very good at raising large number of troops. It's the opposite of the situation that you see with the Ukrainians. But the other thing is the Russians employ their troops on the front line in very cautious ways. It's the reason that they have not captured a lot of territory. A lot of people in the West like to argue that the Russians are launching frontal attacks. It's like throwing troops into a meat grinder, and huge numbers of Russian soldiers are dying, many more than Ukrainian soldiers. This is simply not true. If you look at what's happening, and quite a few Ukrainian commanders comment on this, the Russians are actually remarkably cautious. They use small clusters of infantry to sort of feel out where the Ukrainian forces are, and then they use firepower of one sort or another. It could be artillery, it could be drones, it could be glide bombs, all to attack the infantry, the Ukrainian infantry that's been ferreted out by the Russian infantry. So the Russians are not suffering great casualties on the front lines. Of course, they're suffering some casualties. This is a war of attrition. Both sides have lots of firepower, and lots of people are going to die. But the Russian casualty levels are just not very high. And when you marry that to the fact that they're mobilizing huge numbers of troops, you come to realize that they have a large reserve of forces they can deploy at some point in time. They've not chosen to do that. But one has the sense that at some point the Russians are going to launch a massive offensive where they bring together many of those reserve forces that they've raised over the past 2 years and try to break through in a major way to the Dnieper River. Now, that might not happen. Who knows for sure what the Russians are thinking? But they, I think, have a significant advantage in manpower. Excuse me. And you would expect them to take advantage of that at some point.
And you're speaking about the higher ups. You said a second ago that you think maybe that 44th Brigade commander was making that public statement to signal to the higher ups that, hey, we need more troops. Sersky also made the public comment that they're outgunned, outmanned 3-1 or 6-1, depending on where you're talking about there. Again, probably signaling to operational that we don't have enough troops. So one would imagine that then Zelensky would be really focused on doing whatever he could to get more troops. But instead, he seems to be taking advantage of this opportunity with the drone strike or the veered off drones, whatever, that went into Poland and were shot down to get more money and to get more equipment, etc., thinking that that's actually the stand. Here's how he put it.
How to prevent the war from expanding, and how to stop Russian steps from escalating. Joint forces are absolutely enough for this. Today, there is a lot of international work on this, from all the leaders. I thank every leader who supported Poland, who supports Ukraine, and who understands the threat to the countries on the eastern flank, and that it is drones that Russia is now making the main tool for murder and destabilization. However, the missile threat does not decrease. Russia continues to build its military industry. We talked about all this with the leaders of Europe, specifically with the Prime Minister of Poland, Tusk, the Prime Minister of the UK, Starmer, the head of the Italian government, Meloni, and the NATO Secretary-General, Rutte. It is important to continue to coordinate.
So he's acknowledging not just the manpower is growing on the Russian side. He brought into the situation that the Russian military industrial capacity continues to expand. Not even that it's already over, but that it's getting larger. It hasn't even plateaued yet. So why does he then think that this joint force, and I don't know what he's talking about joint force, because I haven't seen anybody else talking about sending troops in to fight with Ukraine. So I'm not sure where he's going with this.
Well, he's just trying to keep the West, and here we're talking mainly about the United States at this point in time, in the fight. If it's Ukraine alone versus Russia, or Ukraine with minor support from the West against Russia, this war is over with very, very quickly. Ukraine absolutely needs Europe and the United States to support it in a major way. And the great problem that Zelensky and Ukraine more generally faces is that the United States is slowly but steadily breaking away from supporting Ukraine. And Trump is trying to shift the burden onto the Europeans. And Zelensky is surely smart enough to know that the Europeans can only do so much, and that the future of European support looks kind of bleak because the economies in places like France, Britain, and Germany are anything but healthy. They're in real trouble, in fact, and we see this most clearly in the French case. So it's not clear that the Ukrainians can rely on European support for another year or two or three, much less American support. So what Zelensky is doing is waging an intense propaganda campaign that's designed to keep the West seriously committed to Ukraine. But if you go beyond that general set of points that I just made, and you sort of get down to the nitty gritty, and you ask, what exactly do they expect the West to give them? What do the Ukrainians expect from the West? And how is that going to influence events on the battlefield, which is what really matters? You don't see much evidence that the West can help them. We, first of all, can't provide manpower. And with regard to weaponry, we don't have the industrial bases in the various countries of the West. That includes the United States to produce the weapons that Ukraine needs to redress the imbalance in weaponry between Ukraine on one side and Russia on the other side. And as you pointed out, at the same time, the Russian industrial base is pumping out weapons like crazy. The Russians have a huge inventory of weapons that the Ukrainians can't come close to matching. And the Ukrainians therefore need help from the West, but the West can't give them much help. And all of this just indicates that Ukraine may be good at waging the propaganda war or the information war, but in the final analysis, that's not what matters. What matters is what happens on the battlefield. And when you look at the situation up there, as we were talking about a few minutes ago, it's hard to see how Ukraine rescues the situation.
Now, one of the people that he mentioned, Zelensky did in that last clip, was that he's coordinating closely with Mark Rutte, the Secretary General for NATO. Mark Rutte seems to be on board because he made a statement following this incursion of the drones into Poland that we need to be focused more on building up the military capacity. So it's almost as though, and I'd like your view on the backside of this, that Mark Rutte is going, let's just drag this war out as long as we can so that we can continue to maybe build up that capacity, because winning this is ultimately going to be in how many weapons we can make.
The Supreme Allied Commander will continue to actively manage our deterrence and defense posture along the entire eastern flank. Allies are resolved to defend every inch of Allied territory. We will closely monitor the situation along our eastern flank, our air defenses continually at the ready. This only reinforces the importance of NATO and the path to which allies agreed at our summit in The Hague earlier this year. We need to invest more in our defense, ramp up defense production, so we have what we need to deter and defend. And we need to continue to support Ukraine, whose security is interlinked with our own.
I want to pick it on that last part first. Why do you think that NATO and the elite in Europe are so keen to make a connection that their security is tied in with Ukraine? I understand Zelensky said that from the beginning. He keeps saying, I'm fighting for you, I'm fighting for Europe, which I thought was always lunatic. But now it seems like more than Zelensky, you have the Europeans trying to say their security is linked to Ukraine. How can that be, or why should it be?
Well, it shouldn't be. The fact is that these people are so deeply invested in this war that to do a 180-degree turn and back off from supporting Ukraine or working hard to negotiate some sort of settlement, which would end up looking like a Russian victory, is untenable. They just can't bring themselves to do that. So they have concluded that if they double down, they can eventually rescue the situation. I think they're fully aware of the arguments that you and I make, which is that they can't fix this problem in the short term. But I think they believe that if they can hold on now and improve the amount of weaponry or the numbers of weapons and the quality of the weaponry that they produce and give to Ukraine, that will go a long way towards rescuing the situation. I think it's delusional. I'm sure you do as well. But it's quite clear that as time goes by, if anything, the Europeans, not the Americans, but the Europeans, increase their commitment to Ukraine. And this, Danny, raises the very interesting question. If we're right about what's going to happen on the battlefield, and at some point in the not too distant future, the Ukrainian forces are going to crumble, at least on parts of the battlefield, and the Russians are going to end up winning some important victories, what are people in the West going to do? What are people like Mark Rutte going to do? You want to remember that they're so heavily invested in this war at this point, and they're continuing to double down, that you're now in a situation where if the West loses, if NATO loses, this will be a devastating blow. And are they just going to accept that fact? Are they just going to say, well, the Russians won? We gave it our best shot. It didn't work out, and we have to swallow this bitter pill. Is that likely to happen? I don't think so. I think the pressure to escalate in the West and to double down further if the Ukrainian forces begin to crumble will be enormous. And we will be in a very dangerous situation. I think that the bottom line here is that the longer this war has gone on, the greater the potential for escalation, one way or another.
So let me ask you something in terms of what Rutte is trying to get done there, because he keeps talking about we need to have this more investment, and we need to raise defense spending to 5% GDP across the alliance and all that kind of stuff. There seems to be, to me, that there is economic pressure that would mitigate against that. And let me tell you what I mean. So when the war started and Russia made its initial invasion in February 2022, I think the evidence suggests that they thought that demonstration was going to coerce the Ukraine government into a quick deal that they didn't make in December of that year. And when that didn't happen, they didn't have a plan B. They were not resourced to fight a long sustained war. And so they had to, batten down the hatches. And it took them the better part of a year and a half, maybe 2 years, to get their defense industrial base up to where it could produce what it's producing right now. But they weren't ready on that at the beginning. But because this was an existential fight for them, they did whatever it took to ramp it up. We aren't in an existential fight. Europe is not, their troops aren't dying. Their land is not being blown up. So there's not that pressure. And so it seems to me, especially at this point in the conflict, that even though the European side would want to ramp up to that level, it seems like the firms would have to say, okay, hang on, it'll take years to get to some of this place. And there's a lot of financing that would have to go into it and a lot of capital up front. And then what if the war's over before that thing even happens, or a year from now? Let's say it drags out that long. From an economic and business perspective, are you going to want to invest that much money into something that you think that we're not going to need 2 million artillery shells per year production after the war's over? So why invest in something that can't pay back?
I agree. I mean, if you look at the situation in France and in Germany, and it's true in Britain as well, to support all this defense spending, it's quite clear you're going to have to cut social spending. And I think that's politically impossible to do. These are, welfare states, and people expect that they're going to be taken care of, the citizenry in these states, that is. I think the idea that you're going to be able to take money away from social programs and put it into defense is delusional. It's just not going to work, not over the long term. And furthermore, as you point out, even if they do that, and they can sell it politically, the fact is that by the time those investments pay off and those countries are producing the necessary weaponry, this war will be over with. It's just not going to last that long. And therefore, I think that the West is in deep trouble. And just like you, don't understand why they haven't settled this one or moved to settle this one earlier.
We've talked about the industrial capacity. We've talked about the manpower issue. Well, one of the other opportunities that the West is wanting to use to take advantage of this drone incursion to kind of cast new light on something is in the financial realm. And so we have Kaja Kallas on the diplomatic front saying, hey, I know, let's just bring enough sanctions pressure and that will do the trick.
Ukraine's bravery, backed up by international support, has already prevented Russia from achieving its military goals. But it's not enough. The only option we have is to pile more pressure on Russia, provide more support to Ukraine, and prepare for the day after. Honourable members, more pressure on Russia means more sanctions and continued work to address circumvention, including dismantling the Shadow Fleet. On sanctions, like I said, we are now working on the 19th package and collecting input from the member states.
Even in her own comments there, it seems to be lost on her that we already have 18 packages that have never moved the dial any in changing Russian behavior. And somehow you think the 19th one will?
I don't know what to say. You want to remember that when this war started, one of the reasons that we basically pushed the Ukrainians to walk away from the Istanbul negotiations when it looked like you were going to settle the war in March, April of 2022 was because we thought we could defeat the Russians. And it was not so much on the battlefield, although we thought the Ukrainians would do very well on the battlefield. We thought that sanctions were what was going to be principally responsible for slaying the dragon, that we could put unprecedented sanctions on Russia and bring Russia to its knees. That did not work out at all. If anybody's been hurt economically as a result of this conflict in Ukraine, it's the Ukrainians and the Europeans, not the Russians. So we've tried sanctions, and as you point out, all those sanction packages have not worked, hardly at all. And now they're talking about more sanctions. But for everyone who studied this issue, it's quite clear that there's no magic bullet here. You know, people were talking about, and still talk about, I guess, secondary sanctions. And this is where we can't sanction Russia directly. So what we do is, in effect, sanction those countries like China and India that are importing Russian oil. That's the secondary sanctions, secondary in the sense that it's not the Russians you sanction, it's the Chinese and the Indians. Well, the Americans have figured out that you can't sanction the Chinese. You put secondary sanctions on them, they'll retaliate.
Well, actually, this is a perfect segue into this. You say we figured it out. I'm not sure we have, because here from last Sunday is Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent seeming to go in that exact direction.
President Trump, Vice President Vance had a very productive call with EU President Ursula von der Leyen on Friday. She followed up with a call with me, and we are talking about what can the two EU and the U.S. do together. And we are prepared to increase pressure on Russia, but we need our European partners to follow us, because if the U.S. and the EU do this together, we are in a race now between how long can the Ukrainian military hold up versus how long can the Russian economy hold up. And if the U.S. and the EU can come in, do more sanctions, secondary tariffs on the countries that buy Russian oil, the Russian economy will be in full collapse, and that will bring President Putin to the table.
So as an international theorist, expert that you are, is it possible for U.S. and Europe to bring that kind of pressure on India and China?
I don't think so. If it was, we would have done it already. Trump talked about secondary sanctions a long time ago. You want to remember that the reason we had the August 15th meeting in Alaska was because Trump was looking for a way to get out of the sanctions threat that he had levied on the Russians. Remember, on August 8th, August 8th. This is a week before the August 15th meeting. Secondary sanctions were supposed to go on Russia, which meant you were going to sanction China and India. And Trump understood that that was the last thing he wanted to do. So he sent Witkoff scurrying off to Moscow to meet with Putin and to beg Putin to have a meeting. They didn't have that meeting on August 15th because the two sides had been working out an arrangement on how to settle this conflict. None of that had happened. There was no preparation for a meeting of that sort on August 15th. The meeting on August 15th, right, was set up as a way of avoiding putting secondary sanctions on Russia on August 8th, as Trump had promised. And one of the first things that Trump said after the August 15th meeting was that secondary sanctions were taken off the table. And the reason that they were taken off the table is that Trump understood that they wouldn't work. He couldn't put secondary sanctions on China because China could do things to the United States that would hurt us greatly. And he didn't want to put secondary sanctions on India, although he ended up slapping another 25% worth of tariffs on the Indians so that their tariff level is now up to 50%. But he doesn't want to go further than that with regard to India. In fact, I would bet that they're probably looking for a way to back off from those additional 25% worth of tariffs that they've put on the Indians.
Well,
So,
I actually saw it yesterday, and I wish I had thought to bring this up, but on the Trump's Truth Social and on Modi's X account, both presidents featured a screenshot of the other president's comments that, hey, we're trying to find a way out of this. I'm sure we're going to be able to. We still want to have friendly relations. So it looks like they're trying to make some progress on that, which would seem to make it incredibly unlikely that we would then be ready to level more sanctions either on India or China, because if India doesn't agree to stop buying Russian oil, and I don't think they even can agree to that, then we're going to find some other way out of this, and therefore that problem is not going to be solved of getting them to stop buying Russian oil.
Danny, the Indians have increased the amount of oil they're buying from the Russians. This has not worked. The 50% tariffs have not worked. And you can call the second 25% worth of tariffs on India secondary sanctions if you want. They've not worked. And we saw what happened at the recent SCO meeting in China, where the Indians, the Russians, and the Chinese were acting like bosom buddies. I mean, it just didn't work.
Right.
Trump understands that secondary sanctions is not a meaningful option. But what is he doing instead? He's asking the Europeans to put 100% secondary sanctions on Russia, which means 100% secondary sanctions on China and on India. He wants the Europeans to do that. Do you think the Europeans are foolish enough to do that? No, they're not. So we can have all this talk about the United States and Europe getting together and putting secondary sanctions on Russia, which again means China and India. But I find it hard to believe that we're going to do that. And if we do it, it's not going to work.
So do you think it's possible then that in light of that, that maybe Besant's comments from this Sunday aren't as detached from reality as they appear, but because he predicated it on Europe doing these things, that maybe Trump is laid in this situation to where, okay, well, if the Europeans aren't going to do it, we're not going to do it without them. And so we're not going to do it, because I can't even imagine that Europe is going, with their economic situation, is going to slap 100% tariffs on both India and China. Do you?
No, I mean, it's not going to happen. You see no movement in that direction. Right? What you get in the West is just a lot of empty talk. There's just all this talk about doing this and doing that, but nothing concrete ever comes out of it. We just continue to talk about all these different ploys for bringing Russia to its knees, for ending the war, for coercing the Russians, giving more weaponry, giving more money to the Ukrainians, putting greater sanctions on Russia. I mean, there's just no there. We have no levers. This one's going to be settled on the battlefield. And Ukraine's situation on the battlefield is dire. We went through the numbers. Okay. The question then is, what is the West going to do to rectify that situation? Do you hear these people talking about how they can rectify this great imbalance that you have on the battlefield? No, they don't talk about that. And if you don't talk about that and you don't provide some sort of workable solution for rectifying the imbalance of power on the front lines, this is just all beside the point.
Yeah, and then that is going to just lead to the very unpleasant circumstances that you described earlier in this episode of what are we going to do when the inevitable happens and the battlefield plays out the way the numbers indicate they will, and we have to deal with the loss. And I guess we'll just punt that off until some other day and figure it out and find some other way to spin it, I guess, because we seem to be setting up that very condition.
Well, I think we're kicking the can down the road. The other thing, Danny, I think you want to keep your eye on is the fact that Trump has to make sure that when Ukraine falls, that when the Ukrainian army crumbles and the Russians are clear winners, that he can't be blamed for failing to support Ukraine. So what Trump is trying to do is to support Ukraine, mainly at a rhetorical level, and he's trying to push as much of the burden as possible on the Europeans. But he's not pulling out of the fight, which is why you can make a case that he doesn't look that different than Joe Biden. But I think a lot of this just has to do with the fact, not that he thinks that the Ukrainians can rescue the situation, but that he has to protect himself so that he doesn't end up looking the way Joe Biden did when Afghanistan went down.
Yeah, well, good luck with that. I'll just leave it at that. While we have you on today, I want to pivot over to the Middle East because lots been happening there as well since we had you on last. And that is that while Israel and the United States with Steve Witkoff and Hamas were trying to negotiate either a ceasefire or the release of the hostages or both, hopefully to get to an end of that war, all of a sudden, out of nowhere in Qatar, who was acting as an independent mediator, Israel launched an attempted assassination against the delegation, the negotiators for Hamas, who were trying to reach a negotiated settlement to get the hostages released. What is your, and I've got some comments from some of the people who've been involved with this, but I just kind of want your off the cuff observations of what does this do to the, I guess, the state of diplomacy in the Middle East?
Well, it is an Exocet missile in that whole diplomatic enterprise. There's just no question about that. But this is hardly surprising. It's very important to understand that Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli government, they're not interested in a ceasefire. They're not interested in a negotiated settlement to the Gaza genocide. What Netanyahu wants to do is he wants to ethnically cleanse all of Gaza. He wants to drive all of the Palestinians out. And he does not want a ceasefire. He does not want some sort of agreement that leaves the Palestinians in Gaza. As you well know, he's now trying to raise Gaza City. He's trying to drive the remaining Palestinians in northern Gaza down into this giant concentration camp that they've created for the Palestinians in southern Gaza. And then once they're all corralled in this concentration camp, they'll murder them or create circumstances where they can drive them into Egypt or into another country. But that's what Netanyahu wants. And what happened in Doha is that Netanyahu struck with the thought in mind that this would be a fatal blow to any future negotiations. After all, he was talking about killing the negotiators. How can you negotiate if you kill the negotiators?
Well, I mean, that's the operative question. And one might I would say think. One might hope that the U.S. would be aggravated about that Trump would be upset because, for crying out loud, he had his guy, Steve Witkoff, in the process of negotiating with those very Hamas people and Qatar to try and find a way out of this. And all of a sudden, here this thing gets blown up. Now, you wouldn't think that, though, if you listen to Trump's golfing buddy, Lindsey Graham.
Number one, President Trump has been great supporting Israel. He's the best friend Israel's ever had in the White House. I understand what they're saying about Qatar. We have 10,000 troops there. But here's my take. 48 hours ago, President Trump issued an ultimatum to Hamas, this is your last chance. So what did Israel do 48 hours after the ultimatum? They took them down. What did these people have in common who died in Qatar? They all had their fingerprints on planning October the 7th or cheerleading October the 7th. When we killed bin Laden in Pakistan, we didn't call Pakistan. We had nothing to apologize for. Israel has nothing to apologize for. Hamas has been giving every opportunity to lay down their weapons and leave and have sanctuary. They choose to fight. They choose to destroy their own people. I don't blame Israel one bit.
I mean, it's hard to even comment on that because he's saying he's implying here that Trump was actually part of this. And in fact, Gary, if you could pull up that Truth Social from Trump 2 days before this, Trump claimed in here, he said, everyone wants the hostages home. Everybody wants the war to end. The Israelis have accepted my terms, and it is time for Hamas. I have warned Hamas about the consequences of not accepting. This is my last warning. There will not be another one. And then 2 days later, this happens. Now, certainly gives room for the impression that the negotiations were all a ruse to lure the Hamas negotiators into a place where they would be known and then attacked by Israel. What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, those were not his terms. The Israelis dictate the terms and Trump delivers them. Trump is basically a prisoner of the Israelis. I like to say that the two of them are joined at the hip, but it's the Israelis who really drive the train here. And we got a set of parameters from the Israelis. We delivered those parameters to Hamas. And Hamas was meeting for the purpose of negotiating with the United States. It's, in my opinion, unthinkable to kill the negotiators. I mean, if you go back to the Vietnam War, would we have thought about, attacking the North Vietnamese negotiators in Paris? No. I mean, nobody even talked about that. When you're at war with another country or another group, what you do is you have negotiations and you don't kill the negotiators. It's just something you don't do. And it looks like in this case, Trump didn't know that the Israelis were going to try to kill the negotiators. But I think it's quite clear that the Israelis had to get permission from us beforehand. Because they were going into Qatar, and we have a huge air base in Qatar, and we have all sorts of ways of picking up the fact that they're attacking into Qatar. So I think the Israelis surely alerted us to the fact that they were going to strike in Doha. But we gave them the green light. It had to be the case. We clearly didn't tell them that they couldn't do it. But I don't think that Trump was in cahoots with the Israelis in setting up the Hamas negotiators for the kill.
Well, Trump may not have been in cahoots, but Israel most assuredly was, because here was the Israeli foreign minister the day before the attack talking about how the war could come to an end in one day if the negotiations work.
The war in Gaza, my friend, can end tomorrow. President Trump said it clearly yesterday. Israel said yes to his proposal. We are ready to accept a full deal that would end the war based on the cabinet decision.
And yet we know that, I mean, they were already in the final planning, and just hours later, less than 24 hours later, they launched this attempted assassination, which, quite unlike Israeli actions in the past, didn't actually succeed. But I mean, what does this tell you about the state of diplomacy? I think you alluded to this at the first, but I mean, this seems to be a pretty dark situation here, which now makes any future negotiations on almost anything associated with Israel and the United States, who's going to listen to us?
Well, Danny, first of all, what's happening in Gaza, as I said, is that the Israelis are trying to drive all the Palestinians out, and they're not interested in diplomacy. They say they are, and of course, the Western media basically plays along with the Israelis, and there's all this talk about diplomacy. But the Israelis are executing a genocide in Gaza. And of course, the mainstream media never uses that word to describe what they're doing, doesn't even refer to it as mass murder. And they're doing this, they're executing this genocide in pursuit of ethnic cleansing. They want to drive the Palestinians out of Gaza, and they eventually want to drive the Palestinians out of the West Bank. All you have to do is look at what they're doing. It's perfectly obvious. And furthermore, the more right-wing members of the government say that explicitly. It's no great secret. It's not something that I'm making up. So what the Israelis did in Qatar with their attack on the Hamas negotiators is hardly surprising. And furthermore, it's hardly surprising because they can get away with it because the United States will protect them no matter what they do. We give them unconditional support. So the Israelis are free to roam around the Middle East. They're attacking Lebanon. They're attacking Syria. They're attacking Yemen. They're threatening to attack Iran again. They attacked Qatar. I mean, this is just the way they operate. And what does the United States do? The United States supports them. Now, I think President Trump would like to work out some sort of deal to put an end to the Gaza genocide. But that would involve getting tough with the Israelis because the Israelis don't want to end the genocide. They want to drive all the Palestinians out. So the question is, when push comes to shove, who wins, Trump or Netanyahu? And the answer is that Netanyahu wins. And then this brings us to the question that you ask. Can you trust the Israelis? Absolutely not. Who in their right mind would ever trust the Israelis? And can you trust the Americans? Absolutely not.
And you, speaking of Benjamin Netanyahu, so I haven't seen this on any mainstream news outlet, and I'm certain we won't, but we will hear. And so I just played you that comment from the day before of the Israeli foreign minister talking about a negotiated settlement, that Hamas can end the war in just tomorrow if only they'll accede to the terms, et cetera, that were set out there. Then you have, in the aftermath of the attack, you have Benjamin Netanyahu, who here is going to tell you that it's going to ignore like that never happened, that there was no negotiations. And instead, this is almost like October 9th or something, like right after 10/7, and that they're going after the perpetrators of this attack. Note the change here.
We went after the terrorist masterminds who committed the October 7th massacre. And we did so in Qatar, which gives safe haven. It harbors terrorists. It finances Hamas. It gives its terrorist chieftains sumptuous villas. It gives them everything. So we did exactly what America did when it went after the terrorists, the Al-Qaeda terrorists in Afghanistan, and after they went and killed Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. Now the various countries of the world condemn Israel. They should be ashamed of themselves. What did they do after America took out Osama bin Laden? Did they say, oh, what a terrible thing was done to Afghanistan or to Pakistan? No, they applauded. They should applaud Israel for standing and up to these same principles and carrying them out. And I say to Qatar and all nations who harbor terrorists, you either expel them or you bring them to justice. Because if you don't, we will.
So he is as bold and as brash and as in your face as it can be. And one other thing that I'm going to point out, even before I get your comments here, is he condemned Qatar for harboring terrorists and actually supporting Hamas, oblivious to the fact that even the New York Times very clearly says that Benjamin Netanyahu has been supporting Hamas for years prior to this. And much of that money was funneled through Qatar because they helped them out. Now he wants to pretend like that he's, umbraged, that how dare they support terrorists, etc., when they were hosting the negotiations that his foreign minister set up. What do you say to all that?
Well, there is no question that before October 7th, Benjamin Netanyahu was working with Hamas and Qatar to keep a lid on Gaza. There's no question about that. Benjamin Netanyahu preferred to keep Hamas alive inside of Gaza because Hamas was not interested in a two-state solution. Benjamin Netanyahu lived in fear of the Palestinian Authority under Mahmoud Abbas because Abbas was interested in a two-state solution. And Netanyahu does not want a two-state solution. So he worked instead, Netanyahu, with Hamas, and they worked through Qatar. So what he's now saying sounds like extreme hypocrisy, which is what we would expect. Another point I would make here, Danny, is that killing Osama bin Laden is a lot different than killing negotiators. We had negotiations taking place in Doha. Those negotiators were recognized by the United States. The United States was working with those negotiators. Steve Witkoff, in particular, was working with those Hamas negotiators. And the Israelis were as well. And what happened here is not like killing Osama bin Laden, it's killing the negotiators for the other side. The final point I would make is the use of the term terrorist is a term I do not like at all, because it's just a way of smearing the other side. And calling Hamas terrorists, I think, is wrongheaded. They are basically freedom fighters. You can disagree with what they're fighting for, but they want their land back. They want their homes back. They believe that the Israelis stole their homes, stole their land from them, and they want it back. They're a resistance movement. And calling them terrorists is just a way of delegitimizing them and making it possible to do almost anything you want against them because you're portraying them, in effect, as the font of all evil.
And I'm just curious, what do you say to those people who would push back on that and say, well, look what they did to that bus a couple of days ago, those two Palestinian gunmen who killed a bunch of people in Israel in retaliation for what's been going on. How does that fit into the freedom fighter part?
I think freedom fighters and states sometimes engage in acts of terrorism. And I'm not condoning those acts of terrorism. But to just simply call them terrorists, would you want to call Israel a terrorist state? If we call Hamas terrorists, why don't we call Israel a terrorist state? We don't call Israel a terrorist state, although Israel is killing huge numbers of civilians and has been killing huge numbers of civilians for a long period of time. In fact, they're executing a genocide in Gaza, but we don't call Israel a terrorist state. We call any resistance movement that we don't like terrorists, right? And that's, a way of winning the propaganda war. Again, you don't have to like what Hamas represents, and I can understand why Israel and its supporters don't want to call Hamas a freedom fighter organization. But the fact is they are freedom fighters. They're people who are fighting to get land that once belonged to them back. They believe the Israelis stole that land from them and they want it back. And there's no question that they sometimes engage in terrorism, but I would not call them a terrorist organization any more than I would call Israel a terrorist state.
Fair enough. I want to get back to, in the last few minutes we have here, the potential fallout from this. So it's one thing if the United States is either turning a blind eye or even cooperating with Israel and destroying diplomatic norms. but then there may be some consequence to this buildup. And in light of the fact that Turkey has suspended economic relations with Israel, Spain has an arms embargo on it. So there's actually some actions being taken. France and UK are apparently about to formally recognize the Palestinian state. And then this morning, just hours ago, actually, there was finally a comment from Mohammed bin Salman from the Saudi Arabia about this attack on Qatar, and it's pretty strong.
We reject and condemn the Israeli authorities' aggressions in the region, most recently the brutal assault on the brotherly state of Qatar. This attack requires an Arab, Islamic and international response to confront such aggression and to take international measures to stop the occupying power and deter its criminal practices aimed at destabilizing the security and stability of the region. We stand fully with the state of Qatar in whatever measures it takes, without limit, and we will dedicate all our capabilities to this cause.
So what do you make of that statement there, especially saying that whatever Qatar does, no matter what, with no limits, we will support it? What might that mean?
Talk is cheap. Right? Let's see what they do. Saudi Arabia has an Abraham Accord. The United Arab Emirates, it has an Abraham Accord. Let's see both of those countries put an end to the Abraham Accord. I mean, talk is cheap. This is what you get from the Europeans. They talk. Nobody does anything here. How long has this genocide been going on? And what have these people done? What has Saudi Arabia done?
And let's look at that. What does Saudi Arabia have to gain by keeping the Abraham Accords in place as opposed to tearing it up? What are the pros and cons or the cost for Saudi Arabia to do that?
Well, I think that Saudi Arabia wants to have good relations with the United States. And I think the Abraham Accord that it has with Israel is a step in that direction. I think the Saudis genuinely want to have good relations with Israel. I think the Saudis have long been willing to accept an Israel in the Middle East. They've long promoted a two-state solution to the problem. And I think the Saudis at this point in time don't have other countries that they can really turn to provide security for them the way the United States can. So that is what I think explains why the Saudis have the Abraham Accord. And I think the same thing is true for the UAE. But I think if the Saudis and the UAE were to say to the United States and to Israel, the Abraham Accord or the Abraham Accords that we have with Israel are finished. It's just over with, given Israeli behavior. I think that it would work to their advantage over the long term. I think Saudi Arabia has a certain amount of leverage over the United States. The United States needs Saudi Arabia. And this will be increasingly true as we move forward because China is becoming a more and more influential player in the Middle East. And countries like Saudi Arabia have been moving toward China over time. And this is not something that makes the United States happy. So the Saudis have some leverage. But again, are they going to do that? Are they going to put an end to the Abraham Accord? I doubt it.
Saudi Arabia is not actually a formal member of the Abraham Accords. I know that's what they're trying to get. And maybe that's part of the issue is that Trump really wants that to happen because he wants the credit for expanding the Abraham Accords, et cetera. Israel has been trying to get that. But
yeah,
then
you're right. My apologies, Danny. My brain slipped out of gear. Right. Saudi Arabia doesn't have an Abraham Accord. It's the UAE that has it.
And lastly, what about Qatar? I mean, other than voicing outrage, talking, as you say, is there any practical actions that they can take as a result of this?
It's hard to see what they can do. They're not going to throw the Americans out of that air base that they have in Qatar. I don't see what kind of leverage they have.
Well, and that's part of the problem then is that you get Israel with these, I mean, they already blew up a diplomatic compound in 2024 in Syria. virtually no expert or external consequence to that. They're doing this genocide, as you point out there. They're systematically wiping the country or the territory of Gaza literally to dust to drive the people out. And now then here they attack into Qatar, and there doesn't seem to ever be any consequence to it. Ergo, as you just saw with Benjamin Netanyahu, this incredibly in-your-face bold statement, I think we can expect this to continue on. How do you see it?
I think we can expect it to continue on. I mean, there's no reason to think that anything is going to change.
Is there a line beyond which Israel could ever go that there would be consequences in the region, that somebody would take action more than what Turkey has already?
Well, there's a genocide taking place in Gaza. What more can you do besides execute a genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza? I mean, I'm not sure what the Israelis could do. One might argue that the cumulative effect of continuing this genocide will reach the point where the Israelis have to back off. You can make that argument, but I don't see any evidence that that's happening. As you pointed out, the French and the British are talking about recognizing a Palestinian state this month. And there's all sorts of other movement in countries around the world where they express their anger at what Israel is doing. But it really doesn't add up to much. And as I said at the top of the show, the United States protects them at every turn. So the Israelis understand that if they do get into trouble, the United States will come to the rescue. You know, with regard to both France and Britain, the United States is working overtime to prevent France and Britain from recognizing a Palestinian state. And this is just evidence of how the United States covers for Israel at every turn.
Well, with that kind of pressure, and I mean, if we were ever going to do anything, the genocide alone should be enough, as you pointed out. And whether we were in direct coordination and cahoots with Israel in this attack or not, we clearly didn't take any action after the fact, even though it was a complete destruction of the normal diplomatic realm. So I think I can't disagree with you. It looks like that we'll continue to give diplomatic backing and covering, and the people will continue to die until some point when, I don't know, I guess the end finally arrives. Some threshold is crossed. We can only hope so for the people of Palestine.
Although it's hard to define what that threshold would be. As I say, what is the threshold beyond genocide that would cause the United States and other countries to crack down on Israel?
I guess we'll find out. But it hadn't been reached yet. We do know that. But we really appreciate you coming on as always today and giving us the stark clarity on these things and putting all these comments in genuine context, whether we like the outcome or not. We do deserve to know the truth and reality about it. And we really appreciate your very clear and concise comments about these things. Thank you very much.
You're more than welcome, Danny. It was my pleasure being on the show.
And always great for us to have you on here. Thank you very much. And as a quick reminder, if you like to get your information on podcasts, don't hesitate to go to where you get your favorite podcasts on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podcast Addict, etc. Just type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive. And have your friends go there, because I know a lot of people prefer podcasts. Just make sure they know that that's where to find us. And also on Substack, we have the written performance there at danieldavisdeepdive.substack.com, and you will find written opportunity there. We want to give you every opportunity you have for these shows so that you and your friends can get the truth however you prefer to get your information, because we need more folks to get the truth and be unintimidated and uncompromised to get the truth around them, to make sense of the world that we see. Thank you very much, folks, and we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.